Hey guys, tonight we begin with silk sheets, secret ceremonies, and suffocating surveillance. Concubines were literally carried to the emperor's bedroom naked, wrapped only in a silk sheet, because clothes were considered a security threat that could hide weapons. Forget the romantic palace fantasies Hollywood sold you. The Imperial Chinese Harem was a prison where even your pajamas could get you killed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just been appointed as head eunuch in charge of Imperial bedroom logistics. Your job description includes maintaining detailed records, following strict protocols, and ensuring that the Emperor's evening activities are conducted with all the excitement and spontaneity of a tax audit. Every evening after the Emperor finished his duties, which included reviewing state documents, receiving ministerial reports, and probably complaining about the quality of his tea, he would make his way to the palace for what was euphemistically called taking care of his family. This wasn't a tender family dinner or story time with the children. This was business. After the Emperor's second meal of the day, which was timed with the precision of a Swiss watch and served on porcelain that cost more than most people's annual income, the head eunuch from the Office of Affairs would approach. In his hands he carried a meticulously arranged tray filled with jade plaques. Each plaque was inscribed with the name of an imperial consort in careful calligraphy that had probably taken someone hours to perfect. Now, you might think this selection process was random, like pulling names from a hat, but you'd be wrong. These plaques were carefully curated by high-ranking eunuchs and influential court figures who had turned consort scheduling into an art form. They understood the subtle science of plaque positioning, ensuring that favored consorts had a better chance of being chosen through strategic placement on the tray. The Emperor, often fatigued from a day of being the most powerful man in the empire, would casually glance at the tray and flip a plaque. He probably thought he was making a random choice, unknowingly influenced by the subtle positioning of certain names. Palace politics at work, even in matters of the bedroom. Once flipped, the selection was final. No take-backs, no do-overs. No, actually, I changed my mind. The chosen concubine's fate for the night was sealed with all the finality of a court decree. But this was just the beginning of the process. Oh, you thought selecting someone was the end of it? That's adorable. In Imperial China, even bedroom visits required more paperwork than a mortgage application. The chosen concubine now faced what can only be described as the world's most elaborate preparation ritual. This wasn't simply freshening up or putting on nice clothes. This was a full-scale operation that involved more steps than assembling IKEA furniture and was probably just as stressful. First, the concubine had to follow strict protocols that would make modern spa treatments look like quick rinses. She was required to bathe thoroughly in specially prepared herbal water. This wasn't just any water. This was water that had been infused with fragrant oils and medicinal ingredients believed to enhance beauty and fertility. Someone had spent considerable time researching the exact combination of herbs, oils, and whatever else they thought would please the emperor. The bathing process itself was a ceremony. The water temperature had to be perfect. The herbs had to be the right proportions. The oils had to be properly mixed. There were probably quality control standards that would impress modern pharmaceutical companies. After bathing, the concubine was attended by palace maids, who meticulously combed her hair and prepared her appearance. These weren't casual hairstylists. These were professionals who understood that one misplaced hairpin could have political ramifications. They combed, arranged, and styled with the precision of surgeons. Then came the clothing, or rather, the lack thereof. The concubine was dressed in only a silk blanket embroidered with auspicious symbols. Someone had carefully selected these symbols for their supposed lucky properties. Dragons for power, phoenixes for grace, flowers for beauty. Every thread had meaning, every pattern had purpose. The silk itself was probably worth more than most people's houses. It was woven by master craftsmen, dyed with expensive pigments, and embroidered by artisans who had trained for years to perfect their technique. And it was essentially being used as very expensive bedwear. But wait, there's more. The concubine was then inspected by a senior eunuch to ensure she carried no hidden weapons or poisons. Yes, you read that correctly. Even intimate encounters required security screening. The eunuch would carefully examine the concubine, checking for anything that might pose a threat to the emperor's safety. This security measure wasn't paranoid. It was practical. Throughout history, Rulers had been assassinated by people they trusted, including intimate partners. The inspection was thorough, professional, and probably deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Once cleared by security, the concubine was placed on a perfumed stretcher. She couldn't walk to the emperor's chambers. That would be undignified and potentially dangerous. Instead, she was carried by eunuchs through the dimly lit corridors of the palace, like precious cargo. The stretcher itself was perfumed with expensive incense, sandalwood, jasmine, whatever scents were considered appropriate for the occasion. The bearers were trained professionals, who knew exactly how to carry their delicate cargo without jostling or disturbing her carefully arranged appearance. This transportation method served multiple purposes. It was a sign of the concubine's submission and the emperor's power. It was also a security measure, ensuring that the concubine couldn't conceal any dangerous items beneath robes or clothing. And it was probably just traditional at this point. One of those customs that nobody questioned because it had always been done that way. The journey through the palace corridors was likely surreal. Dimly lit hallways, silent eunuchs, the soft scent of incense, and the knowledge that this entire elaborate ritual was leading to what was supposed to be an intimate encounter, but felt more like a state ceremony. Upon arrival at the emperor's chamber, there was one final inspection, because apparently, the first inspection wasn't thorough enough. This wasn't just double-checking. This was triple-checking, with the kind of attention to detail that would impress air traffic controllers. The final inspection took place just outside the imperial bedchamber. Another senior eunuch would carefully examine the concubine one more time, ensuring that nothing had been missed during the first inspection, and that nothing had been acquired during the journey through the palace corridors. This inspection was probably even more thorough than the first. By this point, the concubine had been bathed, dressed, inspected, transported, and was about to be inspected again. The level of scrutiny was extraordinary. The kind of security screening that modern airports would envy. Once cleared for the second time, the concubine was carefully placed on the imperial bed. Not laid down, not seated, but placed, like a valuable object being positioned for display. The eunuchs would arrange her carefully, ensuring that her pose was appropriate and that the silk blanket was properly positioned. The imperial bed itself was probably a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Carved wood, silk coverings, embroidered pillows, and decorations that represented the height of luxury. It was less a piece of furniture and more a symbol of imperial power and wealth. But even after all this preparation, the protocols weren't finished. Oh no, we're just getting started with the rules that governed what happened next. During the encounter, strict protocols were enforced. The concubine was required to observe complete silence unless the emperor initiated conversation. Complete silence, no words, no sounds, no expressions of pleasure or discomfort. Silence. This wasn't just a preference, this was a rule. Speaking without permission was considered inappropriate and potentially dangerous. The emperor was the only one allowed to initiate conversation, and if he chose not to speak, then the entire encounter would take place in complete silence. The reasoning behind this rule was complex. Silence reinforced the hierarchy of the imperial court. It demonstrated the concubine's submission and the emperor's absolute authority. It also prevented any possibility of the concubine saying something inappropriate, inflammatory, or potentially treasonous. Think about that for a moment. Even in the most intimate setting possible, there were rules about who could speak and when. The emperor's bedroom wasn't a place for casual conversation or getting to know each other. It was another venue for demonstrating power relationships and maintaining protocol. The emperor himself was also expected to observe this silence, unless he chose to break it. Speaking was his prerogative, but even he wasn't supposed to engage in casual chatter. The entire encounter was supposed to be conducted with the dignity and restraint appropriate to his imperial status. Time was also strictly monitored. The emperor usually had about 1 hour to spend with the concubine. 1 hour. Not a romantic evening. Not a leisurely encounter. But a precisely timed appointment that was managed with clockwork precision. Eunuchs were stationed outside the chamber, with the responsibility of tracking time. They would remind the emperor when the session was approaching its end. If the emperor didn't respond to their first reminder, they would call out again, and if he still didn't respond, they would eventually enter the chamber to check on him. This time management wasn't arbitrary. It was designed to prevent concubines from developing deeper influence by lingering in the emperor's presence. Too much time together might lead to emotional attachments that could affect political decisions. Better to keep things brief and businesslike. The elaborate security measures and strict protocols weren't just ceremonial nonsense. They were the result of very real, and very justified fears. Being an emperor wasn't just about luxury and power. It was about survival in a world where assassination attempts were common, and often came from the people closest to the ruler. Throughout Chinese history, emperors faced constant threats. Some of these threats came from political rivals, military generals, or foreign enemies, but some came from within the palace itself, from servants, advisors, and yes, even concubines who had their own reasons for wanting the emperor dead. The palace was a hotbed of intrigue, rivalry, and political maneuvering. Different factions competed for influence, and sometimes that competition turned deadly. Concubines weren't just romantic partners. They were potential political assets, spies, or even assassins working for rival factions. The strict protocols during intimate encounters were designed to minimize these risks. By limiting the concubine's ability to move freely, speak without permission, or bring any objects into the emperor's presence, the palace officials could reduce the chances of an assassination attempt. Some emperors were more paranoid than others, but the fear was always there. Palace officials took extreme measures to protect the emperor, including detailed background checks and surveillance on concubines. Some concubines were monitored constantly, their movements tracked, their conversations recorded, their activities scrutinized for any sign of disloyalty. The selection process for concubines often involved extensive investigations into their families, their backgrounds, and their potential connections to enemy factions. Being chosen as an imperial concubine wasn't just an honor. It was a security clearance that required intensive vetting. In the Qing dynasty, strict protocols were enforced to prevent concubines from staying overnight with the emperor. This wasn't about maintaining distance for romantic reasons. This was about security. The longer a concubine spent in the emperor's presence, the more opportunities she had to harm him. Unlike in previous dynasties, where concubines might spend days or weeks with the emperor, Qing protocols limited encounters to brief, carefully monitored sessions. After the allotted time, eunuchs would wrap the concubine in a silk blanket again and carry her back to her own quarters. This practice ensured that the emperor's chamber remained undisturbed and prevented concubines from developing the kind of ongoing access that could be exploited for harmful purposes. It also maintained the emperor's authority by demonstrating that even intimate partners were subject to strict rules and limitations. The fear of assassination wasn't paranoid delusion. Throughout Chinese history, there were documented cases of emperors being killed by people they trusted. Some were poisoned by servants, some were stabbed by guards, and some were murdered by family members or romantic partners. One of the most dramatic examples occurred during the Ming dynasty, with Emperor Jing. He was notoriously cruel to his concubines, forcing them to participate in dangerous alchemical experiments as part of his obsession with immortality. He made them drink toxic potions, subjected them to painful procedures, and treated them more like laboratory subjects than human beings. Many of these women fell ill or died due to the poisonous concoctions they were forced to endure. The emperor's quest for eternal life was literally killing the people around him, and eventually some of them decided to fight back. In 1542, a desperate group of palace women, led by a senior concubine, conspired to assassinate Emperor Jing. They planned to strangle him with a silk ribbon while he slept. It was a carefully planned operation, born out of desperation and years of abuse. But their attempt was poorly executed. The emperor managed to break free from their attack, and the conspirators were captured. Their punishment was brutal, even by the standards of Imperial China. They weren't just executed, they were subjected to slow and torturous deaths as a warning to others. The ringleader was sentenced to death by 1,000 cuts, a form of execution reserved for the most severe crimes. It was a prolonged torture that could last for hours or even days, designed to inflict maximum suffering before finally allowing death. This assassination attempt only heightened Emperor Jing's paranoia. After the failed plot, he further isolated himself, rarely appearing in public or attending court meetings. His distrust of palace women deepened, and he implemented even stricter security measures and more intensive surveillance of his concubines. The incident became one of the most dramatic examples of internal rebellion within the imperial court, illustrating the dangerous tensions that existed within the supposedly secure confines of the Forbidden City. It also demonstrated that even the most powerful rulers lived in constant fear of the people closest to them. Among all the elaborate rules and protocols governing the Imperial Harem, perhaps none were as superstitious and arbitrary as those surrounding menstruation. In ancient China, menstrual blood was considered not just unclean but actively dangerous to the emperor's health and spiritual well-being. This wasn't simply a matter of personal hygiene or comfort. This was treated as a serious threat to imperial power. Chinese traditional beliefs held that contact with menstrual blood could bring misfortune, weaken a man's vital energy, and even taint the emperor's connection to the divine mandate that legitimized his rule. Think about that for a moment. The most powerful man in the empire, someone who controlled armies and governed millions of people, was supposedly vulnerable to a natural biological process that affected half the population on a regular basis. The emperor's cosmic authority could apparently be undermined by something that happened to women every month. This superstition created a complex system of signaling and avoidance that required careful coordination among palace officials and concubines. When a concubine was menstruating, she needed to indicate her unavailability without explicitly discussing the subject, which was considered too indelicate for polite conversation. Different dynasties developed different methods for handling this delicate communication. During the Han Dynasty, concubines would wear special gold rings as silent indicators of their condition. These rings were probably expensive and ornate, because even menstrual notification accessories had to reflect the wealth and status of the imperial court. Imagine being a concubine and having to maintain a collection of special jewelry, specifically for indicating when you were menstruating. Someone had to design these rings, craft them from precious metals, and ensure they were properly distributed to all the women in the harem. There was probably an entire bureaucratic department responsible for menstrual notification jewelry. In the Tang Dynasty, the system was slightly different. A concubine would submit a folded note, discreetly handed to the head eunuch, who would then ensure her name was temporarily removed from the selection pool for the evening. This created a paper trail of menstrual cycles, which means somewhere in the imperial archives there were probably detailed records of when each concubine was unavailable. Some dynasties adopted visual cues that were even more obvious. Concubines might tie a red ribbon around their wrist or place a red lantern outside their chambers. The symbolism was clear. Red meant stop, don't select this person tonight. It was like a traffic light system for imperial bedroom management. But here's where it gets even more bureaucratic. Some ambitious concubines reportedly concealed their menstruation to avoid losing favor with the emperor. They were willing to risk the supposed spiritual contamination, because missing too many selection opportunities could damage their standing in the harem hierarchy. This deception was treated as a serious offense if discovered. Lying about your menstrual cycle was essentially lying to the emperor, which was a form of treason. The consequences could include punishment, demotion in rank, or even expulsion from the palace. To prevent such deception, some palace administrations went to extraordinary lengths. Eunuchs were tasked with monitoring the menstrual cycles of concubines to ensure accuracy in reporting. They maintained detailed calendars tracking each woman's monthly cycle, probably with the kind of precision that modern fertility clinics would admire. This level of surveillance was both invasive and absurd. Grown men, often educated and sophisticated individuals, spent their time creating charts and schedules based on the menstrual cycles of hundreds of women. It was bureaucracy taken to its most intimate and ridiculous extreme. The record-keeping was probably extensive. Palace officials likely maintained detailed logs noting which concubines were available on which nights, cross-referenced with lunar calendars, seasonal festivals, and other important dates. Someone had to compile this information, analyze it for patterns, and present reports to higher authorities. Imagine being the eunuch responsible for presenting the monthly availability report to the emperor. Your Majesty, according to our calculations, Concubine Li will be available Tuesday through Saturday. Concubine Wang is currently unavailable, but will return to the rotation next week. And Concubine Chen's schedule aligns favorably with the lunar festival next month. This hyper-surveillance further highlighted the oppressive and meticulous control imposed upon women within the Forbidden City. Every aspect of their bodies, their cycles, and their availability was monitored, recorded, and managed by male officials who treated human reproduction like an administrative challenge. The women had no privacy, no autonomy over their own bodies, and no ability to make personal decisions about their intimate lives. They were essentially living inventory in a carefully managed system designed to serve the emperor's needs, while protecting him from imaginary spiritual dangers. Being chosen by the emperor wasn't always the blessing it appeared to be. In fact, sometimes it was exactly the opposite. Imperial favor could be dangerous, politically destabilizing, and ultimately fatal for the women who received it. When an emperor became obsessed with a single consort, it often ignited jealousy and palace rivalries that could have far-reaching political consequences. Other concubines would resent the favored woman's special status. Palace officials would worry about her growing influence, and sometimes the emperor's infatuation would distract him from his duties as a ruler. One of the most famous examples of this dangerous favoritism was Yang Guifei, one of the four beauties in Chinese history, and the beloved concubine of Emperor Xuanzong of the Tang dynasty. Her story illustrates perfectly how imperial love could become imperial disaster. Yang Guifei wasn't just beautiful, she was intelligent, talented, and charismatic. The emperor didn't simply enjoy her company. He became completely infatuated with her, to the point where his obsession began to affect his ability to govern effectively. Emperor Xuanzong became so deeply charmed by Yang Guifei that he neglected state affairs. Instead of reviewing important documents, he spent time with her. Instead of meeting with ministers, he composed poetry for her. Instead of making difficult political decisions, he focused on pleasing his beloved concubine. This might sound romantic, but it was politically catastrophic. The emperor's preoccupation with Yang Guifei led to widespread dissatisfaction among officials and military leaders, who watched the empire's administration suffer while their ruler pursued his romantic interests. Yang Guifei's family also gained significant power and influence through her relationship with the emperor. Her relatives were appointed to important positions, given valuable estates, and allowed to accumulate wealth and authority that they probably didn't deserve based on their qualifications. This nepotism created resentment among other noble families and court officials, who saw less qualified people advancing simply because they were related to the emperor's favorite concubine. The imperial court began to split into factions, with some supporting Yang Guifei's family and others opposing their growing influence. The political situation became increasingly unstable. Military generals grew frustrated with the emperor's distraction and the corruption that seemed to accompany Yang Guifei's rise to prominence. Regional governors questioned the emperor's leadership. Foreign enemies sensed weakness and began to probe China's defenses. In 755, these tensions exploded into open rebellion. General Anlushan led a massive uprising against the Tang dynasty, exploiting the weakened state of the empire caused by the emperor's preoccupation with Yang Guifei and her family's growing power. The Anlushan rebellion wasn't just a military conflict. It was a direct result of the political instability created by the emperor's romantic obsession. What had started as a love story had become a threat to the entire empire. As rebel forces approached the capital, the imperial court was forced to flee. The emperor, Yang Guifei, and their entourage began a desperate journey to safety in Sichuan province. But even in retreat, the political consequences of their relationship continued to haunt them. The emperor's own soldiers, frustrated by the downfall of the empire and seeking someone to blame, demanded that Yang Guifei be executed. They saw her as the cause of their troubles, the woman whose beauty had distracted their ruler and led to military disaster. The soldiers were angry, demoralized, and looking for a scapegoat. They had watched their empire crumble, while their emperor paid more attention to his concubine than to his duties. They had seen unqualified relatives of Yang Guifei gain power, while more deserving candidates were ignored. They had witnessed corruption and incompetence flourish under her influence. Fearing mutiny, Emperor Xuanzong had no choice but to order Yang Guifei's death. The woman he loved more than his empire had to die to save what remained of his rule. It was a tragic end to what had begun as a romantic relationship, but had become a political catastrophe. Yang Guifei was led to a temple in Mawei, where she was forced to take her own life. Some accounts suggest she was strangled by imperial guards to spare her the trauma of suicide. Either way, she died because her relationship with the emperor had become too dangerous for the stability of the state. The emperor's grief was reportedly profound and lasting. Even after Yang Guifei's death, Emperor Xuanzong mourned her deeply, longing for her presence and regretting the political circumstances that had forced him to sacrifice the woman he loved. Poets and artists later romanticized their tragic love story, turning Yang Guifei into a symbol of beauty so powerful it could topple empires. But the reality was more prosaic and more disturbing. She had died not because of her beauty, but because of the political consequences of her relationship with a man who couldn't separate his personal desires from his public responsibilities. Her story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial favoritism and the price women paid for becoming too important to emperors who were supposed to put the state above their personal interests. The Imperial Harem wasn't just a collection of beautiful women waiting to please the emperor. It was a complex bureaucratic institution with ranks, hierarchies, protocols, and administrative procedures that would make modern corporate structures look simple by comparison. At the top of this hierarchy was the empress, who held the highest rank and the most political influence. Below her were various levels of consorts, each with specific titles, privileges, and responsibilities. There were imperial concubines, noble consorts, pure consorts, and virtuous consorts, each rank carefully defined and regulated. The ranking system wasn't arbitrary. It was based on factors like family background, personal accomplishments, beauty, intelligence, and the emperor's favor. Women could be promoted or demoted based on their performance, their behavior, and their success in producing male heirs. Each rank came with specific living quarters, clothing allowances, food rations, and numbers of servants. A high-ranking concubine might have her own courtyard with dozens of attendants, while a lower-ranking woman might share cramped quarters with several others. The clothing regulations alone were probably more complex than modern dress codes. Different ranks wore different colors, fabrics, and jewelry. The number of pearls on a headdress, the quality of silk in a robe, and the type of embroidery on a sash all indicated a woman's status within the harem hierarchy. Palace officials maintained detailed records of each woman's rank, privileges, and performance. They tracked promotions, demotions, rewards, and punishments with the precision of human resources departments. Someone had to compile these records, update them regularly, and ensure that proper protocols were followed. The selection process for new concubines was equally bureaucratic. Potential candidates were identified through empire-wide searches, family nominations, and regional competitions. They were evaluated based on beauty, education, musical ability, and family background. Once selected, new concubines underwent extensive training. They learned palace etiquette, proper behavior, artistic skills, and the complex rules governing their interactions with the emperor and other palace residents. This training could last for months or even years. The training curriculum probably included courses on imperial history, Confucian philosophy, poetry, music, dance, and conversation skills. Women had to learn how to walk properly, bow correctly, serve tea appropriately, and engage in intelligent discourse without appearing too assertive or independent. There were probably examinations to test their knowledge and skills. Imagine taking a final exam on proper techniques for approaching the imperial presence, or advanced studies in subtle flirtation within Confucian moral framework. The educational standards were high, because these women weren't just decorative objects. They were expected to be cultured, intelligent companions, who could engage the emperor in meaningful conversation while also maintaining appropriate deference and respect. Once trained, concubines were assigned to specific duties beyond their potential intimate encounters with the emperor. Some managed palace gardens, others organized cultural events, and some served as tutors for imperial children. The harem was a working community with various responsibilities and functions. The daily schedule of a concubine was probably more structured than most modern jobs. There were specific times for meals, education, exercise, artistic practice, and social interaction. Everything was regulated, supervised, and recorded by palace officials. Competition among concubines was intense and carefully managed. Palace officials monitored relationships, prevented alliances that might threaten stability, and intervened in conflicts that could disrupt the harmony of the harem community. The psychological pressure must have been enormous. Hundreds of women competing for the attention of one man, knowing that their success or failure could determine their entire future. Some would rise to positions of influence and comfort, while others would spend their entire lives in obscurity. Many concubines never even met the emperor, let alone developed any kind of relationship with him. They lived their entire lives in the palace, serving the imperial family, but never achieving the intimate connection that had supposedly justified their presence there. For these women, the palace was essentially a very luxurious prison. They couldn't leave, couldn't marry other men, couldn't pursue independent careers, and couldn't make meaningful choices about their own lives. They were trapped in a golden cage, waiting for opportunities that might never come. The Imperial Harem couldn't function without its army of eunuchs, men who had undergone castration to serve in the palace without posing a sexual threat to the emperor's concubines. These men formed a complex administrative hierarchy that managed every aspect of harem life. Eunuchs weren't just guards or servants. They were administrators, diplomats, educators, and power brokers who often wielded significant influence within the imperial court. Some eunuchs rose to positions of enormous authority, serving as advisors to emperors and managers of vast bureaucratic networks. The castration process that created eunuchs was brutal and dangerous. Many men died from the procedure or its complications. Those who survived faced a lifetime of physical and psychological challenges, but also the possibility of achieving power and wealth that would have been impossible for intact men in palace service. Eunuchs were considered safer than normal men because they couldn't father children who might threaten the imperial succession. They also couldn't form romantic relationships with concubines that might complicate palace politics. Their altered status made them theoretically neutral parties in the complex sexual and political dynamics of the harem. But eunuchs weren't emotionally neutral. They formed their own alliances, pursued their own interests, and sometimes developed intense relationships with the women they supervised. Some eunuchs became protective mentors to specific concubines, while others used their positions to exploit or manipulate the women under their authority. The ranking system among eunuchs was as complex as the hierarchy among concubines. There were head eunuchs, senior eunuchs, junior eunuchs, and specialized eunuchs responsible for specific functions like education, entertainment, security, and household management. Head eunuchs often accumulated enormous wealth and power. They controlled access to the emperor, managed palace finances, and made decisions that affected thousands of people. Some became so influential that they essentially governed the empire behind the scenes, while emperors focused on their personal pleasures. The relationship between eunuchs and concubines was complicated and often tense. Eunuchs had authority over the women, but the women might have direct access to the emperor that eunuchs lacked. This created a delicate balance of power, where both groups needed each other, but also competed for influence. Eunuchs were responsible for maintaining detailed records of harem activities. They tracked which concubines were selected, when they were summoned, how long they spent with the emperor, and what gifts or punishments they received. These records were probably extensive and meticulously maintained. The record-keeping wasn't just administrative housekeeping. It was intelligence gathering. Palace officials used these records to identify patterns, track relationships, and detect potential problems before they became serious threats to imperial stability. Some eunuchs specialized in particular aspects of harem management. There were eunuchs responsible for wardrobe, others for education, some for entertainment, and others for discipline. Each specialty required specific knowledge and skills that eunuchs developed over years of palace service. The education eunuchs taught concubines reading, writing, music, and dance. They were often scholars themselves, educated men who had chosen or been forced into palace service. Their job was to ensure that concubines met the cultural and intellectual standards expected of imperial companions. Entertainment eunuchs organized concerts, theatrical performances, and cultural events within the harem. They managed musicians, dancers, and artists who provided diversion for the emperor and his women. These events were probably elaborate productions that required significant planning and coordination. Security eunuchs were responsible for maintaining order, preventing escapes, and detecting potential threats. They searched concubines, monitored their activities, and investigated any suspicious behavior that might indicate disloyalty or dangerous intentions. Discipline eunuchs handled punishments for concubines who violated palace rules. They administered everything from minor corrections to serious penalties, always following carefully prescribed protocols that ensured punishments were appropriate to the infractions. The psychological impact of being managed by castrated men must have been complex for the concubines. Eunuchs represented both protection and oppression, safety and surveillance. They were men who couldn't threaten the women sexually, but who controlled almost every other aspect of their lives. Some concubines developed close relationships with their eunuch supervisors, viewing them as confidants, protectors, or even surrogate family members. Others resented the constant supervision and the reminder that their lives were so controlled that even their interactions with men required castration as a prerequisite. Pregnancy in the Imperial Harem wasn't just a personal matter. It was a political event that could reshape the balance of power within the palace and potentially determine the future of the empire. The birth of an imperial son could elevate a concubine from obscurity to enormous influence, while failure to produce male heirs could result in decline and marginalization. The pressure on concubines to become pregnant was intense. Their value within the harem hierarchy depended largely on their ability to produce children, particularly male children who could potentially inherit the throne. Women who remained childless for extended periods faced declining status and reduced privileges. But pregnancy also brought new dangers. Pregnant concubines became targets for other women who saw them as threats to their own chances of advancement. Palace intrigue often focused on preventing rivals from successfully carrying pregnancies to term, or ensuring that newborn males didn't survive to become potential heirs. The medical care available to pregnant concubines was probably the best available at the time, but by modern standards, it was primitive and dangerous. Palace physicians used traditional Chinese medicine, herbal remedies, and treatments that were often ineffective or harmful. Childbirth in the imperial palace was attended by teams of specialists including physicians, midwives, eunuchs, and palace officials. The birth of an imperial child was a state event that required proper documentation, witness verification, and immediate political assessment. If a concubine gave birth to a son, her status within the harem would immediately rise. She would receive new titles, better living quarters, increased privileges, and greater access to the emperor. Her family outside the palace might also benefit from her success through appointments, gifts, and imperial favor. But the birth of a daughter, while still significant, didn't provide the same dramatic elevation in status. Female children were valued, but couldn't inherit the throne, so their mothers didn't gain the same political advantages that came with producing potential male heirs. The child's health and survival were matters of enormous concern. Palace officials would carefully monitor the infant's development, provide the best available medical care, and take extensive precautions to prevent illness, accident, or harm from jealous rivals. Infant mortality was high even in the imperial palace. Many children died from diseases, complications, or mysterious illnesses that might have been natural or might have been the result of poison or sabotage by rival factions within the harem. The death of an imperial child was both a personal tragedy for the mother and a political setback that could affect her status for the rest of her life. Women who lost children often blamed themselves, their rivals, or the inadequate medical care available even to the imperial family. Surviving children remained vulnerable to political maneuvering throughout their lives. Imperial sons were particularly at risk because they represented potential threats to the current heir, or to other princes who might compete for succession. Some princes died under suspicious circumstances that suggested political assassination rather than natural death. The emperor's relationship with his children was also complex, and often distant. Imperial fathers were expected to maintain dignity and authority, rather than developing close personal relationships with their offspring. This emotional distance was supposed to prevent favoritism that might affect succession decisions, but it also meant that imperial children grew up with little meaningful connection to their fathers. Concubines who successfully produced surviving children faced new challenges as mothers. They had to protect their children from palace intrigue while also using their maternal status to advance their own positions. Some became fierce advocates for their sons' interests, building political alliances and maneuvering for advantageous positions in the succession hierarchy. The education of imperial children was another area where concubine mothers could exert influence. They might advocate for particular tutors, educational approaches, or cultural training that would give their children advantages in the competition for imperial favor and eventual succession. But maternal influence had limits. Imperial children were often raised by teams of eunuchs, tutors, and palace officials, rather than by their biological mothers. This separation was designed to prevent excessive maternal influence and ensure that imperial heirs received proper education in statecraft, military strategy, and Confucian philosophy. The relationship between concubine mothers and their children was thus both intensely important and artificially constrained. Women fought desperately to produce children who could elevate their status, but then had limited ability to influence those children's development or maintain close relationships with them. The Imperial Harem operated on various rotation systems designed to ensure fairness, prevent excessive favoritism, and manage the complex logistics of maintaining relationships with dozens or hundreds of women. These rotations were planned with the precision of military campaigns and the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized all aspects of palace life. Some dynasties used lunar calendar rotations, where different groups of concubines were available during different phases of the moon. Others employed seasonal rotations that aligned with agricultural cycles, festivals, and astrological considerations. These systems ensured that all concubines had theoretical opportunities to be selected while also maintaining variety for the emperor. The rotation schedules were probably maintained by specialized eunuchs who tracked availability, managed substitutions for illness or other issues, and ensured that proper protocols were followed. These schedules had to account for menstrual cycles, pregnancies, illnesses, punishments, and special occasions that might affect normal rotation patterns. Festivals and holidays often disrupted regular rotation schedules. During important celebrations like New Year, Mid-Autumn Festival, or the Emperor's birthday, special selection procedures might be implemented that favored particular concubines or followed different protocols entirely. The Emperor's personal preferences could also affect rotation schedules. If he developed a particular fondness for certain women, palace officials had to balance his desires against the need to maintain fairness, and prevent the kind of favoritism that could destabilize harem politics. Some concubines tried to manipulate the rotation system to increase their chances of selection. They might cultivate relationships with the eunuchs responsible for scheduling, provide gifts or favors in exchange for advantageous positioning, or time their availability to coincide with periods when competition was reduced. The rotation system also had to account for the emperor's travel schedule. When the emperor left the capital for military campaigns, diplomatic missions, or hunting expeditions, the entire harem schedule would be disrupted. Only a select few concubines might accompany him, while others remained in the palace under the supervision of eunuchs and palace officials. During the emperor's absence, the harem became a different kind of community. Without the central focus of imperial selection and competition for the emperor's attention, concubines might develop different relationships with each other, pursue educational or artistic interests more intensively, or engage in political activities that would be impossible when the emperor was present. The return of the emperor after extended absences would require careful reintegration into normal rotation schedules. Palace officials had to consider which concubines had been faithful during his absence, which had caused problems, and which deserved rewards or punishments based on their behavior while he was away. The Imperial Harem wasn't just a residential community for the emperor's women. It was also a sophisticated intelligence network, where information was gathered, analyzed, and used for political purposes. Concubines, eunuchs, and palace officials all participated in this network, whether willingly or unwillingly. Concubines often came from prominent families throughout the empire, bringing with them knowledge about regional politics, local conditions, and the activities of potential rivals or threats to imperial authority. Palace officials carefully debriefed new arrivals to extract useful intelligence about their home regions. The harem served as a listening post where palace officials could monitor the attitudes and activities of important families across the empire. If a concubine's family was plotting rebellion, engaging in corruption, or pursuing policies that conflicted with imperial interests, their daughter in the harem might provide early warning of these activities. But the intelligence network also operated in reverse. Families with daughters in the harem could gain valuable information about imperial policies, the emperor's mood and preferences, and political developments within the palace. This information could be used to advance family interests or avoid potential troubles. Communication between concubines and their families was carefully monitored and controlled. Letters were read by palace officials, visits were supervised, and gifts were inspected for hidden messages or inappropriate content. Even family relationships were treated as potential security risks that required constant surveillance. Some concubines were recruited as active intelligence agents, tasked with gathering specific information about other concubines, palace officials, or even the emperor himself. These women might be rewarded for providing useful intelligence or punished for failing to report suspicious activities. The eunuch network also served intelligence functions. Eunuchs moved throughout the palace, interacted with various officials and servants, and had access to information from multiple sources. They could compile comprehensive reports about palace activities, personnel issues, and potential security threats. Intelligence gathering within the harem wasn't just about external threats. Palace officials also monitored internal dynamics to prevent the formation of dangerous alliances, detect signs of rebellion or dissatisfaction, and identify women who might pose risks to imperial security. The psychological pressure of living under constant surveillance must have been enormous. Concubines knew that their conversations might be overheard, their letters read, and their activities reported to higher authorities. This surveillance created an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia that affected all relationships within the harem community. Some women learned to navigate this intelligence network skillfully, using it to advance their own interests, while avoiding the dangers of being perceived as threats to imperial authority. Others became casualties of palace intrigue, destroyed by information that was used against them by rivals or suspicious officials. The Imperial Harem was also a significant economic institution that consumed enormous resources, while also generating wealth and economic activity. The cost of maintaining hundreds of women, their servants, their living quarters, and their various needs represented a substantial portion of the imperial budget. Each concubine received regular allowances for clothing, food, entertainment, and personal expenses. These allowances varied based on rank and imperial favor, but even the lowest-ranking women received more resources than most people in the empire could imagine. The clothing expenses alone were staggering. Concubines needed different outfits for various occasions, seasons, and their changing ranks within the harem hierarchy. Each garment was crafted from expensive materials by skilled artisans who specialized in imperial fashion. Food costs were also enormous. The harem required daily deliveries of fresh ingredients, exotic delicacies, and special dietary items for pregnant women, sick concubines, and those with particular preferences or restrictions. Palace kitchens operated around the clock to meet these demands. The economic impact extended far beyond the palace walls. Hundreds of artisans, merchants, and suppliers depended on harem contracts for their livelihoods. Silk weavers, jewelry makers, furniture crafters, and food suppliers all benefited from the constant demand for luxury goods and services. Some concubines came from wealthy families who continued to send gifts, money, and resources to support their daughters in the palace. These contributions supplemented imperial funding and allowed favored concubines to maintain higher standards of living than their official allowances would permit. The gift economy within the harem was complex and politically significant. Concubines exchanged presents with each other, with eunuchs, and with palace officials as part of the network of relationships that determined their success or failure within the palace hierarchy. Imperial favor could be measured partly in economic terms. Concubines who pleased the emperor received valuable gifts, increased allowances, and access to luxury goods that were denied to less favored women. These economic rewards served as both recognition and incentive for continued good behavior. The harem also generated economic activity through its artistic and cultural productions. Concubines created paintings, poetry, music, and crafts that had value both within the palace and in the broader cultural marketplace. Some of these works became treasured imperial artifacts. Educational expenses were another significant cost. The harem employed numerous tutors, music teachers, dance instructors, and other specialists who provided training for concubines. These educational services were expensive but considered essential for maintaining the cultural standards expected of imperial companions. Medical expenses were also substantial. The harem maintained its own medical staff, including physicians, herbalists, and specialists in women's health. The cost of medical care, medications, and treatments for hundreds of women represented a significant ongoing expense. Despite the luxury and privilege associated with life in the imperial harem, the community was governed by strict rules enforced through a comprehensive punishment system. Violations of palace protocols, disrespectful behavior, or perceived disloyalty could result in penalties ranging from minor corrections to severe punishments that could destroy a concubine's life. The punishment hierarchy was as detailed and bureaucratic as every other aspect of palace life. Minor infractions might result in temporary restrictions on privileges, reduced allowances, or assignment to unpleasant duties. More serious violations could lead to demotion in rank, extended isolation, or physical punishment. The most severe punishments included permanent expulsion from the palace, which was often equivalent to social death for women who had spent years in the imperial harem. Expelled concubines rarely found acceptable marriages or social positions outside the palace, and their families might also suffer from the disgrace. Palace officials maintained detailed records of infractions and punishments, creating a comprehensive disciplinary database that tracked each woman's behavior over time. Repeated minor violations could accumulate into grounds for major punishment, while exceptional good behavior might earn clemency for past mistakes. The enforcement of discipline was primarily the responsibility of specialized eunuchs who were trained in appropriate punishment procedures. These officials had to balance the need for order and respect with the recognition that excessive harshness could create resentment and potential rebellion. Some punishments were designed to be publicly visible within the harem community, serving as warnings to other concubines about the consequences of inappropriate behavior. A woman might be required to perform menial tasks usually assigned to servants, wear clothing that indicated her disgrace, or endure other forms of public humiliation. Physical punishment was rare but not unknown. Serious violations might result in beatings administered by eunuchs following carefully prescribed procedures designed to inflict pain and humiliation without causing permanent injury or disfigurement that might displease the emperor. The psychological aspects of punishment were often more effective than physical penalties. Isolation, public shame, loss of privileges, and exclusion from social activities could be devastating for women whose entire lives revolved around their status and relationships within the palace community. Some punishments were specifically designed to exploit the competitive nature of harem life. A concubine might be forced to watch while privileges, gifts, or opportunities were given to her rivals. This psychological torture could be more painful than any physical punishment. The appeals process for punishments was limited, but did exist. Concubines could petition higher authorities for reconsideration of their penalties, but these appeals required careful navigation of palace politics, and the risk that unsuccessful appeals might result in additional punishment for wasting officials' time. Not all concubines remained in the Imperial Harem until death. Some were eventually released or retired from palace service, though the circumstances and procedures for leaving the harem were complex and often unsatisfactory for the women involved. Retirement from the harem typically occurred when concubines reached advanced age and were no longer considered attractive or useful to the emperor. These women might be given small pensions and allowed to leave the palace, but their options for life outside were often limited and unsatisfying. Some retired concubines were permitted to marry, but their prospects were generally poor. Men were reluctant to marry women who had been intimate with the emperor, and former concubines often struggled to adapt to life outside the palace after years or decades of institutional living. Other retired concubines chose to remain in religious institutions, becoming nuns or taking other religious roles that provided some security and social respectability. Monasteries and convents sometimes provided refuge for former palace women who had nowhere else to go. The retirement process was carefully managed by palace officials who had to balance imperial interests with some consideration for the welfare of women who had served the emperor faithfully for many years. These decisions often involved complex negotiations about pensions, living arrangements, and ongoing support. Some concubines never retired in any formal sense, but simply faded into obscurity within the palace as they aged beyond the point where they might be selected for imperial attention. These women might spend their final years as advisors to younger concubines, managers of palace departments, or caretakers for imperial children. The psychological adjustment to retirement was often difficult. Women who had spent their entire adult lives competing for imperial attention suddenly found themselves irrelevant to the central purpose that had defined their existence. Many struggled with depression, purposelessness, and difficulty forming relationships outside the palace hierarchy. Financial support for retired concubines varied widely, based on their former rank, the emperor's favor, and the current political situation. Some received generous pensions that allowed comfortable lives, while others were left with minimal resources and uncertain futures. The families of retired concubines sometimes welcomed them back, but these reunions were often awkward and difficult. Women who had lived in luxury and privilege might struggle to readjust to more modest circumstances, while family members might resent the burden of supporting someone who had failed to secure permanent imperial favor. The strange bedroom rules and elaborate protocols of the Imperial Harem weren't just administrative curiosities. They represented a complex cultural system that reflected Chinese values, fears, and social structures that persisted for thousands of years. The emphasis on protocol and ceremony, in even the most intimate aspects of imperial life, demonstrated the Chinese belief that civilization required the regulation of natural impulses through proper ritual and social order. Even sexual relationships had to be conducted according to appropriate forms that maintained imperial dignity and social hierarchy. The extensive bureaucracy surrounding harem management reflected the Chinese genius for administrative organization and record-keeping that characterized imperial government at all levels. The same mindset that created comprehensive tax systems and judicial procedures was applied to managing the emperor's personal relationships. The security concerns that shaped harem protocols illustrated the perpetual anxiety that accompanied absolute power. Emperors who could command millions of subjects lived in constant fear of assassination by the people closest to them, creating elaborate systems designed to minimize risks that could never be entirely eliminated. The superstitions surrounding menstruation and other aspects of female biology revealed the complex mixture of reverence and fear that characterized traditional Chinese attitudes toward women and sexuality. Women were both essential for dynastic continuation and dangerous to male spiritual purity. The competitive dynamics within the harem reflected broader Chinese social patterns, where individuals competed for advancement within hierarchical systems based on merit, connections, and political skill. The harem was essentially a microcosm of Chinese society, with its emphasis on education, cultural accomplishment, and strategic relationship building. The integration of intelligence gathering and political maneuvering into intimate relationships demonstrated how thoroughly politics penetrated every aspect of imperial life. Even love and sexuality became tools of statecraft and sources of political intelligence. These cultural patterns persisted long after the end of imperial rule, and continue to influence Chinese society in various ways. The emphasis on hierarchy, protocol, bureaucratic management, and the subordination of personal desires to larger social purposes can still be observed in modern Chinese institutions and social relationships. The stories and legends that grew up around famous concubines like Yang Guifei became part of Chinese literary and artistic tradition, inspiring countless poems, paintings, operas and novels that explored themes of beauty, power, love, and political responsibility. Life in the Imperial Harem followed precise schedules that regulated every aspect of daily existence from dawn to dusk. These schedules were designed to maintain order, provide appropriate activities for hundreds of women, and ensure that the harem operated efficiently as both a residential community and a source of imperial companionship. The day typically began before sunrise with ritual ablutions and morning prayers. Concubines were expected to maintain personal cleanliness and spiritual purity through regular bathing, meditation, and observance of religious practices appropriate to their status. Breakfast was served at precisely scheduled times, with different groups of concubines eating in designated areas according to their rank and current status. The food was prepared in palace kitchens and distributed by eunuchs who ensured that each woman received appropriate portions and delicacies. Morning activities included various forms of education and cultural refinement. Concubines might attend classes in literature, poetry, music, painting, or other artistic disciplines. These educational sessions were both enrichment activities and practical training for women who might be called upon to entertain the emperor with their accomplishments. Physical exercise was also scheduled, though it was conducted in forms appropriate to the dignity of imperial concubines. Women might practice traditional dances, engage in gentle calisthenics, or participate in games that provided recreation while maintaining proper deportment. Midday brought additional meals, rest periods, and time for personal grooming and preparation. Concubines used these hours to maintain their appearance, practice their artistic skills, and engage in the careful social interactions that were essential for success within the harem hierarchy. Afternoon activities often included handicrafts, correspondence, and preparation for potential evening selection. Women might work on embroidery, painting, or other artistic projects that could serve as gifts for the emperor or demonstrations of their cultural accomplishments. The evening selection process created particular tension and excitement within the daily routine. As the time approached for the emperor to choose his companion for the night, the entire harem community would be affected by the anticipation and competition surrounding this crucial decision. Those not selected for imperial attention would continue with evening activities including entertainment, conversation, reading, and preparation for sleep. The daily routine had to accommodate both the women who might be chosen for imperial encounters and those who would spend another evening in their own quarters. The physical spaces of the imperial harem were carefully designed to serve the complex functions of this unique community. Architecture, landscaping, and interior design all reflected the need to house hundreds of women comfortably while maintaining security, hierarchy, and appropriate separation from the male-dominated areas of the palace. The harem quarters typically occupied substantial portions of the imperial palace complex, with multiple courtyards, residential buildings, gardens, and specialized facilities for education, entertainment, and administration. These spaces had to be both luxurious enough to reflect imperial status and secure enough to prevent escapes or unauthorized access. Residential quarters were arranged according to the harem hierarchy, with the most favored concubines receiving private courtyards and extensive living spaces, while lower-ranking women shared more modest accommodations. The architecture itself communicated status and served as a daily reminder of each woman's position within the palace community. Gardens and outdoor spaces provided areas for recreation, exercise, and contemplation, while maintaining the enclosed nature of the harem environment. These gardens were often elaborate productions featuring exotic plants, artificial hills, ornamental ponds, and pavilions designed for various cultural activities. Educational facilities included libraries, music rooms, art studios, and performance spaces where concubines could pursue their cultural development and prepare for potential encounters with the emperor. These facilities had to be equipped with appropriate instruments, materials, and furnishings to support high-quality instruction. Religious spaces within the harem allowed for appropriate spiritual observances while maintaining the separation between male and female areas of the palace. These might include private chapels, meditation rooms, and areas designated for seasonal festivals and celebrations. Administrative offices housed the extensive bureaucracy required to manage harem operations, including record-keeping, scheduling, discipline, and coordination with other palace departments. These offices had to accommodate the numerous eunuchs and officials responsible for various aspects of harem management. Security features were integrated throughout the harem architecture, including walls, gates, watchtowers, and other elements designed to prevent unauthorized access. while maintaining the aesthetic standards appropriate to imperial residences. The heating, cooling, and ventilation systems had to accommodate the needs of a large residential community, while maintaining comfort levels suitable for women accustomed to luxury and refinement. These engineering challenges were significant, given the technology available in Imperial China. Healthcare in the Imperial Harem was probably the most advanced medical care available in Imperial China, but by modern standards it was primitive and often dangerous. Palace physicians, herbalists, and other medical specialists provided treatment using traditional Chinese medicine, but their understanding of disease, anatomy, and effective treatments was limited. Preventive care focused heavily on maintaining proper balance among the four humors and ensuring that women followed appropriate dietary, exercise, and lifestyle practices believed to promote health and fertility. These preventive measures were based more on philosophical theory than empirical medical knowledge. Pregnancy and childbirth received special attention, given their importance to imperial succession, but the medical care available was still crude and dangerous. Palace physicians used herbal medicines, acupuncture, and other traditional treatments that might help some conditions, but were ineffective or harmful for others. Mental health issues were poorly understood and often attributed to spiritual imbalance, moral failings, or supernatural influences. Women suffering from depression, anxiety, or other psychological problems might receive treatments that were inappropriate or counterproductive. The isolation of the harem created particular medical challenges, since women had limited contact with the outside world and might be exposed to diseases that spread rapidly through closed communities. Epidemic illnesses could devastate the harem population with little effective treatment available. Medical record-keeping was probably extensive, given the Chinese emphasis on documentation and the importance of tracking the health of potential mothers of imperial heirs. Palace physicians likely maintained detailed records of treatments, outcomes, and patterns of illness within the harem community. The relationship between medical care and palace politics was complex, since physicians might be pressured to provide treatments that served political purposes rather than genuine medical needs. The health of particular concubines might be manipulated to affect their status or their ability to compete for imperial attention. Access to medical care varied based on rank and imperial favor, with higher status concubines receiving more attention and resources than lower-ranking women. This disparity in healthcare reflected the broader inequalities within the harem hierarchy. The elaborate system of rules, protocols, and bureaucratic procedures that governed the Imperial Harem eventually came to an end with the fall of Imperial China in the early 20th century. The last emperor, Puyi, presided over the dissolution of institutions that had persisted for over 2,000 years. The collapse of the imperial system meant that thousands of palace women, eunuchs, and officials had to find new ways of life in a rapidly changing world. Many struggled to adapt to modern society after lives spent in the artificial environment of the palace. Some former concubines were able to marry and establish families, while others remained single and tried to support themselves through various means. The social stigma attached to their palace service often made integration into normal society difficult, and sometimes impossible. The palaces themselves were converted to museums, government buildings, or other modern purposes. The elaborate living quarters, gardens, and specialized facilities that had housed the harem community became tourist attractions and historical curiosities. The cultural legacy of the imperial harem system persisted in Chinese literature, art, and popular imagination. Stories of beautiful concubines, palace intrigue, and imperial romance continued to fascinate people long after the actual institutions had disappeared. Modern scholars studying the imperial harem have revealed the complexity and sophistication of these institutions, while also acknowledging their oppressive nature and the limited options available to the women who lived within them. These historical investigations have provided insights into traditional Chinese society, gender relations, and the intersection of power and sexuality. The end of the imperial harem system coincided with broader changes in Chinese society, including the introduction of modern ideas about women's rights, individual autonomy, and social organization. The contrast between traditional practices and modern values highlighted the extent to which Chinese society was transformed during the 20th century. And so we reach the end of our journey through the strange bedroom rules of the imperial harem. What began as an exploration of supposedly exotic and exciting practices has revealed itself to be something far more mundane, an elaborate bureaucratic system designed to manage human relationships with the same obsessive attention to detail that characterized imperial administration in every other sphere. The imperial harem wasn't a place of unbridled passion and romantic adventure. It was an institution governed by protocols, regulations, and procedures that would make modern government agencies look relaxed and spontaneous. Every aspect of intimate relationships was planned, scheduled, monitored, and documented by officials whose job was to turn human desire into administrative process. The women who lived in this system weren't free agents pursuing their own interests and desires. They were components in a complex machine designed to serve imperial needs while maintaining the elaborate facade of dignity, hierarchy, and proper conduct that Chinese society demanded of its rulers. The elaborate rituals surrounding consort selection, preparation, and presentation weren't romantic traditions. They were security measures designed to protect an emperor who lived in constant fear of assassination by the people closest to him. Even in the most intimate moments of his life, he remained a political figure whose safety required constant vigilance and elaborate precautions. The superstitions surrounding menstruation and other aspects of female biology revealed the strange mixture of reverence and fear that characterized traditional attitudes toward women and sexuality. The most powerful man in the empire was supposedly vulnerable to natural biological processes that affected half the population on a regular basis. The competitive dynamics within the harem reflected the broader patterns of Chinese society, where individuals pursued advancement through education, cultural accomplishment, and strategic relationship building. Even in matters of love and sexuality, success required political skill, careful planning, and ruthless competition. The extensive record-keeping, surveillance, and intelligence gathering that characterized harem life demonstrated how thoroughly politics penetrated every aspect of imperial existence. Nothing was private, nothing was spontaneous, and nothing escaped the attention of officials whose job was to monitor, analyze, and control human behavior. Perhaps the most striking aspect of the imperial harem system was its fundamental contradictions. It was simultaneously luxurious and oppressive, sophisticated and superstitious, elaborate and ultimately unsatisfying for almost everyone involved. The women lived in unprecedented comfort while being denied basic human freedoms. The emperor enjoyed access to hundreds of beautiful companions while remaining isolated and fearful of the people closest to him. The cultural legacy of these institutions persists in various forms, but the actual practices described in this exploration disappeared with the end of imperial rule. Modern China has moved far beyond the elaborate protocols and bureaucratic procedures that once governed the most intimate aspects of imperial life. For contemporary listeners trying to fall asleep to these historical curiosities, the imperial harem serves as a reminder that even the most seemingly exciting and glamorous aspects of the past were often characterized by the same human tendencies toward bureaucracy, regulation, and the transformation of natural impulses into institutional procedures that we recognize in modern life. The strange bedroom rules of the imperial harem weren't really strange at all. They were entirely predictable products of a society that believed deeply in the power of proper procedures, appropriate protocols, and comprehensive documentation to solve human problems and maintain social order. And with that reassuring thought about the eternal human capacity to turn even romance into paperwork, perhaps it's time to close your eyes and drift off to sleep, grateful that your own intimate relationships aren't subject to jade plaque selection processes, security screenings, and the constant supervision of castrated bureaucrats. Sweet dreams, and remember, even the most exotic historical practices were usually just as boring as everything else once you understood how they actually worked. Before we drift off completely, let's spend some time examining one of the most mind-numbingly detailed aspects of imperial harem administration, the management of textiles, because nothing says exciting historical content quite like an in-depth analysis of fabric procurement, storage, and distribution protocols. The imperial harem required an absolutely staggering amount of textiles. We're not just talking about clothing, though that alone would have challenged the production capacity of entire regions. We're talking about bedding, curtains, wall hangings, cushions, rugs, ceremonial banners, cleaning cloths, and dozens of other textile applications that were essential for maintaining the appropriate level of luxury and comfort expected in an imperial residence. Each concubine needed multiple sets of clothing for different seasons, occasions, and her changing rank within the harem hierarchy. A single woman might require winter robes, summer garments, ceremonial dress, casual wear, sleeping clothes, undergarments, and specialized outfits for festivals, religious observances, and potential encounters with the emperor. The quality standards for imperial textiles were extraordinarily high. Palace officials maintained detailed specifications for thread count, weave patterns, dye quality, and decorative elements. These specifications probably filled multiple volumes and required expert knowledge to implement correctly. Silk was the primary material for high-ranking concubines, but not just any silk. The The Imperial Textile Department sourced silk from specific regions known for producing the finest quality fibers. The silkworms were fed carefully controlled diets. The cocoons were harvested at precisely the right moment, and the spinning and weaving processes followed traditional techniques passed down through generations of master craftsmen. Cotton and other materials were used for lower-ranking concubines, and for practical applications like cleaning cloths and everyday undergarments. But even these supposedly inferior textiles had to meet strict quality standards to ensure they were appropriate for use within the imperial palace. The dyeing process was particularly complex and expensive. Imperial textiles featured colours that were often restricted to palace use, including specific shades of yellow, purple and red that could only be worn by people of appropriate rank. The dyes themselves were made from rare and expensive materials: genuine purple from Mediterranean murex shells, deep reds from cochineal insects, and brilliant yellows from saffron or other precious sources. Colour coordination was regulated by detailed protocols that specified which hues were appropriate for different ranks, seasons and occasions. Palace officials maintained colour charts and reference samples to ensure consistency in textile production and to prevent inappropriate use of restricted colours. The embroidery and decorative elements on imperial textiles represented some of the finest needlework ever produced. Master embroiderers spent months or even years creating single garments featuring intricate patterns of dragons, phoenixes, flowers, clouds, and other symbolic elements. Each stitch was carefully planned and executed according to traditional patterns that had been refined over centuries. Storage of these valuable textiles required specialized facilities with proper climate control, pest management, and security measures. Palace storerooms were designed to protect fabrics from moisture, insects, theft and deterioration while allowing for easy inventory management and distribution. The inventory system for imperial textiles was probably more complex than modern warehouse management systems. Palace officials tracked thousands of individual items by type, quality, owner, location, and condition. They maintained detailed records of when items were distributed, to whom, for what purpose, and in what condition. Cleaning and maintenance of imperial textiles was a specialized art that required extensive knowledge of different materials, dyes, and construction techniques. Palace laundries employed experts who understood how to clean delicate silk embroideries without damaging the threads or fading the colors. The seasonal rotation of textiles was a massive logistical undertaking that had to be coordinated months in advance. As weather changed, thousands of garments had to be collected, cleaned, stored, and replaced with appropriate seasonal alternatives. This process required careful planning and precise execution to ensure that every concubine had appropriate clothing available when needed. Quality control inspections were conducted regularly to identify items that needed repair, replacement, or retirement. Palace officials examined textiles for signs of wear, damage, or deterioration that might make them unsuitable for continued use in the Imperial Harem. The beauty standards of the Imperial Harem created an entire industry devoted to producing cosmetics, perfumes, and beauty treatments that met the exacting requirements of palace life. This wasn't simply a matter of providing basic grooming supplies. This was a sophisticated operation that combined chemistry, artistry, and logistics to maintain the appearance standards expected of imperial concubines. Perfume production for the Imperial Harem was particularly complex and expensive. Palace perfumers created custom scents using rare and exotic ingredients sourced from across the empire and beyond. Sandalwood from India, musk from Tibet, ambergris from distant oceans, and countless flowers, herbs, and spices were combined in carefully guarded formulations. The perfume laboratory within the palace was probably one of the most sophisticated chemical facilities of its time. Master perfumers maintained detailed records of formulations, aging processes, and quality control procedures that ensured consistency and excellence in their products. Different ranks of concubines used different quality perfumes, with the most expensive and exotic scents reserved for the highest-ranking women. Palace officials maintained strict protocols governing who could wear which fragrances, and violations of these rules could result in punishment. Seasonal perfumes were created to complement different times of year, with light floral scents for spring, cooling mint and citrus combinations for summer, warm spice blends for autumn, and rich, heavy fragrances for winter. The perfume rotation schedule had to be coordinated with clothing changes and other seasonal adjustments. Cosmetics production was equally sophisticated and regulated. Palace cosmetics included face powders, lip colors, eye makeup, nail treatments, and various preparations for maintaining skin health and appearance. These products were made from carefully selected ingredients and tested extensively to ensure they were safe and effective. The white face powder favored by imperial concubines was made from rice flour, pearl powder, and other expensive ingredients that created the pale complexion considered most beautiful in traditional Chinese society. Different formulations were created for different skin types and seasonal conditions. Lip colors ranged from subtle natural tones to dramatic reds that were reserved for special occasions. These cosmetics were made from plant dyes, mineral pigments, and other materials that had to be carefully processed to ensure they were safe for use on delicate facial skin. Eye makeup included cold preparations for darkening eyebrows and eyelashes, as well as colored powders for creating dramatic looks during festivals and special events. Palace cosmetic specialists maintained detailed knowledge of application techniques and color combinations that were most flattering for different facial features. Hair care products represented another major category of palace beauty supplies. Concubines used special shampoos, conditioning treatments, styling preparations, and decorative elements that kept their hair healthy and attractive despite the elaborate styling required for palace life. The hair ornaments alone represented a significant industry. Hairpins, combs, decorative flowers, and other accessories were crafted from precious metals, gemstones, and exotic materials. Each piece had to be designed to complement specific hairstyles and rank requirements. Nail care was also regulated and standardized. Concubines maintained long, painted nails that required special tools, treatments, and decorative elements. The colors and designs used on nails were subject to the same rank restrictions that governed other aspects of appearance. Skincare regimens included various lotions, oils, and treatments designed to maintain the soft, smooth complexion expected of imperial concubines. These preparations were made from expensive ingredients like bird's nest extract, ginseng, and various herbal combinations. Bath preparations represented another major category of palace beauty products. Concubines used special soaps, oils, and herbal additions to their bath water that were designed to cleanse, perfume, and soften their skin, while providing aromatherapy benefits. The production and distribution of all these beauty supplies required extensive logistics and quality control. Palace officials had to coordinate with suppliers across the empire, maintain proper storage conditions, and ensure that products remained fresh and effective. Feeding the Imperial Harem was a logistical challenge that would have challenged modern food service operations. We're talking about providing multiple daily meals for hundreds of women, plus their servants, plus the eunuchs and officials who managed harem operations, all while maintaining the quality standards and dietary restrictions appropriate to imperial dining. The palace kitchens operated around the clock with different shifts responsible for different meals and different categories of diners. Breakfast preparation might begin at 3 in the morning, to ensure that fresh, hot food was available when concubines were ready to eat at dawn. Menu planning was a complex art that had to account for seasonal availability, dietary restrictions, religious observances, rank hierarchies, and personal preferences. Palace kitchen managers maintained detailed records of what each concubine liked to eat, what foods were forbidden during certain times of year, and which dishes were appropriate for different occasions. The ingredient procurement system extended across the entire empire. Palace food buyers sourced rice from the best agricultural regions, tea from the finest plantations, spices from distant provinces, and exotic delicacies from specialty producers who might spend their entire careers serving imperial requirements. Quality control standards for palace food were extraordinarily strict. Every ingredient was inspected upon arrival, tested for freshness and purity, and stored under carefully controlled conditions. Food that didn't meet palace standards was rejected, regardless of cost or difficulty in replacement. Food safety was a constant concern given the risk of accidental poisoning or deliberate assassination attempts. Palace kitchens employed food tasters who sampled every dish before it was served to concubines or imperial family members. These brave individuals literally risked their lives every day to protect the palace residents. The cooking equipment used in palace kitchens was probably the finest available anywhere in the empire. Specialized woks, steamers, roasting equipment, and other cooking tools were crafted by master metalworkers and maintained by specialists who understood the precise requirements of imperial food preparation. Fuel for the kitchen fires was another logistical challenge. The kitchens required enormous amounts of wood, charcoal, and other combustible materials to maintain the high heat needed for proper cooking. Fuel procurement and storage required careful planning and substantial storage facilities. The serving protocols for palace meals were as elaborate as any other aspect of harem life. Different ranks of concubines received different quantities and qualities of food, served on different types of dishware, accompanied by different beverages and condiments. Dishware for the Imperial Harem included thousands of plates, bowls, cups, serving vessels and utensils made from porcelain, precious metals and other expensive materials. Each piece had to be cleaned, maintained, and replaced as needed to ensure that palace dining standards were maintained. The specialized dietary requirements of pregnant concubines created additional complexity for kitchen operations. Pregnant women received special foods believed to promote healthy pregnancies and proper fetal development, along with dietary restrictions designed to prevent miscarriage or birth defects. Seasonal menus reflected both the availability of fresh ingredients and traditional Chinese beliefs about foods appropriate for different times of year. Spring menus emphasized fresh vegetables and light preparations, while winter meals featured heartier dishes and warming spices. Festival meals required additional planning and preparation, as palace kitchens created elaborate banquets featuring special dishes that were only prepared for important celebrations. These occasions might require weeks of advanced preparation and the coordination of dozens of specialized cooks and assistants. The cleanliness standards of the Imperial Harem created massive daily challenges for the palace staff, responsible for washing, cleaning, and maintaining the living environments of hundreds of women and their attendants. This wasn't just a matter of keeping things tidy. This was an industrial-scale operation that had to meet the hygiene expectations of people accustomed to the highest levels of luxury and comfort. The palace laundry operations were probably among the most sophisticated cleaning facilities of their time. Master launderers developed specialized techniques for cleaning different types of fabrics without damaging delicate silk embroideries, fading expensive dyes, or shrinking precisely fitted garments. Water quality was crucial for effective laundry operations. Palace wells and water storage systems had to provide clean, soft water that wouldn't leave mineral deposits or stains on expensive textiles. Water treatment techniques included filtration, settling, and the addition of various substances to improve cleaning effectiveness. Soap production for palace use was a specialized craft that required knowledge of different ingredients and formulations appropriate for various cleaning tasks. Palace soap makers created gentle preparations for delicate silk garments, stronger formulations for heavily soiled items, and specialized soaps for different types of stains and cleaning challenges. The washing process itself was carefully regulated to ensure that garments belonging to different ranks of concubines were handled appropriately. Higher-ranking women's clothing received more careful attention and gentler treatment than items belonging to servants or lower-ranking palace residents. Drying facilities had to accommodate enormous quantities of wet laundry, while protecting delicate fabrics from excessive sun exposure, wind damage, and contamination from dust or insects. Palace laundries probably featured extensive drying yards with covered areas for weather protection. Ironing and pressing operations required specialized tools and techniques to restore proper shape and appearance to garments after washing. Palace pressing specialists used heated irons, stretching frames, and other equipment to ensure that cleaned clothing met the appearance standards expected in imperial surroundings. Stain removal was a specialized art that required extensive knowledge of different types of stains and appropriate treatment methods. Palace cleaning specialists developed techniques for removing ink, food, cosmetics, and other substances without damaging expensive fabrics. The storage and distribution of clean laundry required careful organization to ensure that each concubine received her own clothing in proper condition and at appropriate times. Palace laundry managers maintained detailed tracking systems to prevent mix-ups and ensure accountability. Beyond clothing, palace cleaning operations had to maintain the living quarters, gardens, walkways, and common areas used by harem residents. This required teams of specialized cleaners with different skills and responsibilities for different types of cleaning tasks. Floor cleaning techniques varied depending on the materials and usage patterns of different areas. Wooden floors required different treatment than stone surfaces, and areas with heavy traffic needed more frequent attention than private chambers used only occasionally. Window cleaning was particularly challenging, given the elaborate decorative glass and screening materials used in palace construction. Cleaning specialists had to maintain clear, streak-free surfaces without damaging delicate materials or disturbing the careful positioning of decorative elements. Garden maintenance represented another major category of palace cleaning operations. Gardeners and groundskeepers maintained the elaborate landscaping that provided pleasant environments for harem residents, while ensuring that outdoor areas met the cleanliness standards expected in imperial surroundings. Pest control was an ongoing challenge that required constant vigilance and specialized knowledge. Palace cleaning operations included measures to prevent and eliminate insects, rodents, and other pests that could damage property, contaminate food, or create unsanitary conditions. Perhaps the most mind-numbing aspect of imperial harem administration was the extensive record-keeping system that documented virtually every aspect of daily life within the palace community. Chinese bureaucratic traditions emphasized thorough documentation of all activities, and the harem was no exception to this obsessive attention to administrative detail. Personnel records for each concubine included detailed information about her family background, education, skills, physical characteristics, health history, and behavioral observations. These files were probably more comprehensive than modern employment records and were updated regularly as circumstances changed. Daily activity logs documented who went where, when, with whom, and for what purpose. Palace officials tracked the movements and activities of concubines with the precision of modern security services, creating detailed records that could be analyzed for patterns or potential problems. Financial records tracked the enormous expenses associated with maintaining the Imperial Harem. Palace accountants documented expenditures for food, clothing, cosmetics, entertainment, education, medical care, and countless other categories of expenses that were necessary for harem operations. Inventory management systems tracked thousands of individual items including clothing, jewelry, furniture, books, musical instruments, art supplies, and other possessions belonging to concubines or used in harem operations. These inventories were updated regularly and cross-referenced with distribution and usage records. Medical records documented the health status, treatments, medications, and reproductive history of each concubine. Palace physicians maintained detailed notes about pregnancies, illnesses, injuries, and medical interventions that might affect a woman's status or availability for imperial attention. Selection records tracked which concubines were chosen for imperial encounters, when these selections occurred, and various details about the circumstances and outcomes of these meetings. This information was probably considered sensitive state secrets, but was carefully documented for administrative purposes. Punishment records documented disciplinary actions including the nature of infractions, the penalties imposed, and the outcomes of various disciplinary measures. Palace officials used these records to track behavioral patterns and ensure consistency in enforcement of harem rules. Educational records tracked the progress of concubines in various cultural and artistic disciplines. Palace tutors maintained detailed assessments of each woman's abilities in music, painting, poetry, dance, and other skills that were considered essential for imperial companions. Communication logs documented all correspondence between concubines and their families, including letters, gifts, and visits. Palace censors maintained detailed records of these communications to monitor for potentially dangerous or inappropriate content. Gift and favor records tracked the various presents, privileges, and special treatments given to different concubines by the emperor or palace officials. These records helped palace administrators monitor the distribution of imperial favor and identify potential sources of jealousy or resentment. Weather and seasonal records documented how environmental conditions affected harem operations, including adjustments to schedules, activities, and resource allocation based on temperature, humidity, precipitation, and other factors. Festival and ceremony records documented the elaborate celebrations and ritual observances that punctuated harem life throughout the year. These records included detailed plans, participant lists, resource requirements, and post-event assessments. The storage and organization of all these records required extensive filing systems, cross-referencing mechanisms, and retrieval procedures that allowed palace officials to quickly locate specific information when needed. The palace archives probably contained millions of individual documents related to harem operations. Access to records was carefully controlled and restricted based on rank and need-to-know principles. Different categories of information were available to different levels of palace officials, with the most sensitive records accessible only to the highest-ranking administrators. As we approach the end of our exhaustive examination of Imperial Harem bureaucracy, let's take a moment to appreciate some of the smaller administrative details that made this system function, or at least appear to function, with the precision that Chinese officials demanded of all government operations. Timekeeping in the Imperial Harem required precise coordination between multiple activities, schedules, and personnel. Palace timekeepers used water clocks, sundials, and other devices to maintain accurate time standards that ensured proper coordination of meals, activities, ceremonies, and other scheduled events. The maintenance of timepieces and timing devices was itself a specialized responsibility that required technical knowledge and careful attention to detail. Palace clockmakers and timekeepers ensured that all timing devices remained accurate and properly synchronized. Communication systems within the harem complex used various methods including bells, drums, messenger services, and visual signals to coordinate activities and transmit information between different areas and personnel. These communication networks had to function reliably in all weather conditions and at all times of day and night. Emergency procedures covered various potential disasters including fires, floods, earthquakes, disease outbreaks, and security threats. Palace officials maintained detailed plans for evacuating concubines, protecting valuable property, and maintaining order during crisis situations. Training programs for palace staff included extensive instruction in proper procedures, protocols, and standards for all aspects of harem operations. New employees received comprehensive orientation and ongoing education to ensure they understood their responsibilities and performed their duties correctly. Quality assurance inspections were conducted regularly to ensure that all aspects of harem operations met established standards. Palace supervisors examined everything from food quality to cleaning effectiveness to security procedures, documenting their findings and requiring corrective action when problems were identified. Supply chain management coordinated the procurement, delivery, storage, and distribution of thousands of different items needed for harem operations. Palace logistics specialists maintained relationships with suppliers throughout the empire and managed complex delivery schedules to ensure that needed materials arrived when and where they were required. Waste management systems handled the enormous quantities of garbage, sewage, and other waste products generated by a community of hundreds of people living in close quarters. Palace sanitation workers maintained cleaning schedules and disposal procedures that prevented health hazards and maintained appropriate cleanliness standards. Security protocols covered everything from personal protection for concubines to property protection for valuable palace assets. Palace security specialists maintained surveillance systems, access controls, and response procedures designed to prevent theft, violence, and other security threats. And with that final administrative detail, we conclude our comprehensive examination of the strange bedroom rules and elaborate bureaucratic procedures that governed life in the Imperial Harem. What began as an exploration of supposedly exotic romantic customs has revealed itself to be exactly what you might expect from Chinese imperial administration. A mind-numbingly detailed system of rules, procedures, and documentation that transformed even the most intimate aspects of human relationships into bureaucratic processes. The Imperial Harem wasn't a realm of passion and romance. It was a government department with procedures manuals, filing systems, and administrative hierarchies that would be familiar to anyone who has ever worked in a large organization. The only difference was that instead of managing budget reports and personnel evaluations, they were managing human sexuality and reproductive potential. And perhaps that's the most reassuring lesson we can take from this exhaustive historical investigation. Even in the most exotic and seemingly mysterious institutions of the past, human beings were doing what human beings have always done, creating elaborate bureaucratic systems to manage problems that probably didn't need to be managed in the first place. With that comforting thought about the eternal human capacity to overcomplicate everything through administrative procedures, it's definitely time to close your eyes and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that no matter how boring your job might be, at least you're not responsible for maintaining the menstrual cycle tracking charts for several hundred imperial concubines. Before we finally allow ourselves to drift into peaceful slumber, let's examine one last fascinating aspect of Imperial Harem administration: the incredibly complex calendar and scheduling system that coordinated all the various activities, ceremonies, and logistical requirements of this bureaucratic maze. The imperial calendar wasn't just a simple listing of dates and months. It was a sophisticated document that integrated lunar cycles, seasonal festivals, astrological considerations, imperial birthdays, religious observances, agricultural seasons, and dozens of other factors that affected palace operations throughout the year. Palace calendar specialists were responsible for creating annual schedules that accounted for literally hundreds of different considerations. They had to coordinate the emperor's official duties with his personal schedule, balance the needs of different government departments with harem requirements, and ensure that all activities followed proper protocols and traditions. The lunar calendar created particular scheduling challenges because it didn't align neatly with seasonal changes or agricultural cycles. Palace officials had to maintain parallel calendar systems that tracked both lunar dates for ceremonial purposes and solar dates for practical planning purposes. Seasonal transitions required massive logistical coordination as palace operations shifted from winter to spring, spring to summer, and so forth. These transitions affected everything from clothing distribution to food menus to heating and cooling requirements throughout the harem complex. Festival scheduling was particularly complex because different celebrations had different requirements for personnel, resources, decorations, special foods, and ceremonial activities. Some festivals lasted for days or weeks and required months of advanced preparation to execute properly. The emperor's personal schedule had to be coordinated with harem activities to ensure that appropriate concubines were available when he might desire companionship, while also allowing time for his official duties, travel requirements and personal preferences. Religious observances added another layer of complexity to palace scheduling. Different religious traditions required different types of activities, restrictions, and ceremonial observances that had to be integrated into the overall calendar without creating conflicts or logistical problems. Astrological considerations played a significant role in imperial scheduling decisions. Palace astrologers consulted star charts, planetary alignments, and other celestial phenomena to identify auspicious dates for important activities and inauspicious periods when certain activities should be avoided. The coordination between imperial calendar specialists and various palace departments required constant communication and adjustment. Changes in one area often created ripple effects that required modifications to schedules and plans throughout the palace complex. Weather considerations had to be factored into scheduling decisions, particularly for outdoor activities, travel plans, and seasonal transitions. Palace meteorologists attempted to predict weather patterns and plan activities accordingly, though their forecasting abilities were limited by the technology available at the time. Imperial travel schedules created major disruptions to normal palace operations. When the emperor left the capital for military campaigns, hunting expeditions, or diplomatic missions, the entire harem schedule had to be adjusted to accommodate his absence and eventual return. The scheduling of concubine rotations had to account for all these various factors while also maintaining fairness, preventing favoritism, and ensuring that the emperor had appropriate companionship available when desired. This required sophisticated planning and constant adjustment as circumstances changed. Emergency schedule modifications were sometimes necessary when unexpected events disrupted normal operations. Natural disasters, political crises, illnesses, or other unforeseen circumstances could require rapid rescheduling of activities and reallocation of resources. Record keeping for calendar and scheduling activities was as detailed as every other aspect of palace administration. Officials maintained logs of scheduled activities, actual outcomes, modifications made, and lessons learned that could improve future planning efforts. As we near the absolute end of our comprehensive examination of Imperial Harem bureaucracy, let's spend a few final moments considering the administrative systems that managed the eventual retirement and pensioning of concubines who had served the imperial household for many years. The retirement eligibility criteria for imperial concubines were complex and based on multiple factors including age, health status, length of service, rank achieved, imperial favor received, and the birth of imperial children. Palace officials maintained detailed records tracking each woman's progress toward retirement eligibility throughout her service. Pension calculations involved sophisticated formulas that considered the concubine's highest rank achieved, the number of years served, any special imperial favor received, and her contribution to the imperial succession through the birth of children. These calculations required careful documentation and multiple levels of review to ensure accuracy. The application process for retirement benefits required extensive paperwork, including detailed service records, health assessments, character evaluations, and financial need calculations. Retiring concubines had to submit formal petitions that were reviewed by multiple levels of palace bureaucracy. Housing arrangements for retired concubines varied based on their pension levels and personal circumstances. Some received apartments within designated areas of the palace complex, while others were provided with resources to establish independent residences outside the palace walls. Medical care provisions for retired concubines represented a significant ongoing expense for palace administration. Former harem residents often had health problems related to their years of palace service and required specialized medical attention that was provided through palace-sponsored healthcare systems. The social integration challenges faced by retired concubines required specialized support services, including counseling, job training, and assistance with marriage arrangements for those who were eligible and interested in establishing families outside the palace. Financial management services helped retired concubines invest and manage their pension payments to ensure long-term financial security. Palace financial advisors provided guidance on investment strategies, expense management, and estate planning for former harem residents. Legal protection services were necessary, because retired concubines sometimes faced discrimination, exploitation, or harassment from people who sought to take advantage of their unusual backgrounds and limited experience with life outside the palace. The monitoring and follow-up systems tracked the welfare and circumstances of retired concubines to ensure they were receiving appropriate support, and to identify any problems that might require palace intervention or assistance. Educational and cultural programs helped retired concubines maintain connections with palace traditions, while also developing new skills and interests appropriate to their changed circumstances. These programs included continuing education opportunities, artistic instruction, and social activities. Family reunion services assisted retired concubines who wanted to reconnect with family members they might not have seen for many years. Palace officials helped facilitate these reunions, while also ensuring that family relationships didn't create security risks or other problems. The death and burial arrangements for retired concubines had to reflect their former status, while also acknowledging their changed circumstances. Palace officials maintained protocols for appropriate funeral services and burial locations that honored their service without exceeding their current social position. Estate settlement procedures ensured that the property and remaining pension benefits of deceased retired concubines were distributed according to their wishes and palace regulations. These procedures required careful legal documentation and oversight to prevent disputes or fraud. And so we finally reach the absolute conclusion of our exhaustive, mind-numbingly detailed exploration of the strange bedroom rules and elaborate administrative procedures that governed the Imperial Harem of dynastic China. We have examined every conceivable aspect of this institution, from jade plaque selection processes to retirement pension calculations. And what have we discovered? We have discovered that human beings, regardless of the historical period or cultural context, possess an absolutely remarkable ability to transform even the most naturally simple activities into bewilderingly complex bureaucratic procedures that require extensive documentation, multiple levels of oversight, and comprehensive administrative systems. The Imperial Harem, which might seem from a distance to have been a realm of romance, passion, and exotic adventure, was in reality nothing more than a government department with personnel policies, operational procedures, and administrative hierarchies that would be entirely familiar to anyone who has ever worked in a large organization. Every aspect of human sexuality and intimate relationships was regulated, documented, scheduled, and managed by officials whose primary concern was maintaining proper procedures and avoiding administrative errors that might disrupt the orderly functioning of their bureaucratic systems. The women who lived in this environment weren't romantic heroines or exotic beauties living lives of passion and adventure. They were essentially employees in a highly regulated workplace, where their personal lives, career advancement opportunities, and retirement benefits were determined by their ability to navigate complex organizational hierarchies and follow detailed operational procedures. The emperor himself, supposedly the most powerful and free individual in the empire, was actually trapped within bureaucratic constraints that regulated his most intimate personal relationships according to administrative convenience rather than human desire or emotional connection. The elaborate rituals, security procedures, and ceremonial protocols that surrounded imperial intimate encounters weren't romantic traditions or expressions of cultural sophistication. They were workplace safety regulations designed to minimize security risks and ensure compliance with organizational policies. Even the superstitions and cultural beliefs that influenced harem operations were ultimately implemented through bureaucratic mechanisms that transformed spiritual and philosophical concepts into administrative procedures, with specific implementation requirements and compliance monitoring systems. The record-keeping systems that documented every aspect of harem life weren't historical preservation efforts or romantic chronicling of imperial love stories. They were standard administrative practices designed to ensure accountability, track performance metrics, and provide documentation for personnel decisions and resource allocation. The massive logistical operations that supported harem life, from textile management to food service to medical care, weren't expressions of imperial luxury or demonstrations of royal power. They were simply the operational requirements of maintaining a large residential institution with complex service needs and quality standards. The educational, cultural, and recreational programs provided to harem residents weren't enlightened approaches to personal development or sophisticated cultural enrichment. They were employee training programs designed to ensure that personnel possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to perform their organizational functions effectively. Even the political intrigue, competitive dynamics, and relationship management that characterized harem social life weren't dramatic expressions of human passion or romantic rivalry. They were simply office politics conducted within an organizational structure that happened to involve intimate relationships rather than quarterly reports and budget meetings. The retirement and pension systems that eventually removed women from active harem service weren't compassionate social programs or recognition of loyal service. They were standard human resources policies designed to manage workforce transitions and maintain organizational efficiency. In the end, the strange bedroom rules of the Imperial Harem weren't strange at all. They were entirely predictable products of the human tendency to create elaborate organizational structures and administrative procedures to manage any activity that involves multiple people and valuable resources. The Imperial Harem serves as a perfect historical example of how bureaucratic thinking can penetrate into the most intimate and personal aspects of human experience, transforming natural relationships into administrative processes that prioritize organizational needs over individual desires or human connections. And perhaps that's the most comforting lesson we can take from this comprehensive historical investigation, as we finally close our eyes and drift off to sleep. No matter how complex and bewildering modern organizational life might seem, we can take consolation in knowing that previous generations faced exactly the same challenges and responded with exactly the same bureaucratic solutions. The imperial concubines who lived hundreds of years ago in the Forbidden City would probably understand perfectly the experience of navigating complex organizational hierarchies, following detailed operational procedures, and managing their careers within bureaucratic systems that often seem to prioritize administrative convenience over human needs. So sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that whether you're dealing with modern corporate bureaucracy or ancient imperial administration, human beings have always possessed the remarkable ability to take simple situations and make them absolutely mind-numbingly complicated through the application of administrative procedures, documentation requirements, and organizational policies. Sweet dreams, and may your own intimate relationships never require jade plaque selection processes, security clearances, or the oversight of castrated bureaucrats with comprehensive filing systems and scheduling coordination responsibilities. Rest well in the comforting knowledge that even the most exotic and mysterious institutions of the past were ultimately just bureaucratic organizations staffed by people who spent their days managing paperwork, following procedures, and trying to make complex systems function smoothly, despite the inherent contradictions and administrative challenges involved in regulating human behavior through organizational policies. Good night. And remember, history's greatest lesson is that bureaucracy is eternal, universal, and absolutely guaranteed to make everything more complicated than it needs to be, regardless of the time period, cultural context, or apparent romance of the situation. Sleep tight.